Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub. Now, the rule of law, constitutional law, trial law, in many ways, that's the foundation of American society. It is also often a center of controversy. How one interprets the Constitution has been an issue discussed and debated for years and years and years. What does the Constitution say? What does the Constitution mean? How important or unimportant is it for today's reading and interpretation of the Constitution to be a reflection of what was in the minds of the founding fathers some 200 plus years ago? And for Jews familiar with discussions of Jewish law, halakha, both the written and oral traditions, issues of textual interpretation and textual application of Torah and Talmudic law. For Jews, the American constitutional process is second nature. And it may be no accident that some of the leading constitutional minds on the American scene have been Jewish. And one of today's leading constitutional legal scholars is a man who has had a long, distinguished, and storied career in and out of the courtroom. It's an honor for me to introduce to you Jay Goldberg, one of the preeminent trial attorneys in our nation's history, who's represented over decades of courtroom dramas such major public figures as the first Jewish Miss America, Bess Meyerson, entertainers such as Bono and Mick Jagger, Willie Nelson, Johnny Cash, industrialist Armand Hammer, the Daily News, politicians like former Congressman Charlie Rangel, and no surprise, Donald Trump. A magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School, Jay Goldberg began his career working in the office of legendary New York District Attorney Frank Hogan. Jay Goldberg was also appointed a U.S. attorney by the Attorney General of the time, Robert F. Kennedy. And in 2011, members of the U.S. Congress honored Jay Goldberg for his work related to the Constitution and constitutional law here in the United States. And Jay Goldberg is the author of 4 books, including The Courtroom is My Theater, which chronicles the sweep of Jay Goldberg's courtroom career from the bright lights of New York and Las Vegas to the beer halls of Milwaukee to the hustle and bustle of Chicago and the world of gangsters and mobsters, to the mining towns of Pennsylvania, the pristine shores of California, to the cherry blossoms of our nation's capital. Jay Goldberg has seen it all, and in the courtroom, he has done it all. It is an honor and a kick for me to welcome you to L'Chaim. Thank you, Jay, for joining us.
Well, Mark, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much. There is so much I want to talk to you about. By the way, this is a fabulous read, a fabulous book.
Thank you.
How long did it take you to write this book?
Well, off and on, about a year.
Off and on?
Yes.
Okay. And by the way, you should know, the book is comprised of short chapters. Each one is another story of Jay's experience, either in a courtroom or related to a well-known individual, in some instances, a publication. Anyway, story after story. It is a fabulous read. Mazal tov on this book.
Thank you.
I hope
Thank
it does
you,
very
Mark.
well. I hope anybody who's interested both in law and a good story. There's good story after good story in this book.
Well,
so congratulations.
All right. Thank you very much.
You say something at the very beginning of the book, and I want you to elaborate for me. Very often I'll say to somebody, tell me about who you are and your background. You say at the very beginning of your book, my childhood was severely dysfunctional.
Yes.
I want you to talk about your early years and the home in which you grew up.
Well, I don't want to overstate it because there are good things to be said about
I
people.
want to know the good and the bad.
My father was a degenerate gambler.
What was his name?
Joseph.
Joseph.
And so much so, they said that when it rained, he would bet on which piece of the raindrop hit the bottom of the windowsill. And during the baseball season, in particular, there was a great deal of hell to pay. He borrowed money from members of the mafia because in the garment center, the mafia controls deliveries. The manufacturer, after he completes the dresses, he has to have it delivered. And somehow the mafia understood that and set up various companies or influenced various truckers to charge enormous sums of money. And they preyed upon people in the garment center who were always
And explain, what did your father do?
My father was a dress salesman. And he was the best and the worst. At the time of the, I came home from Washington, strike that, I came home from Harvard, and I had to learn New York law, and I had about 8 weeks to do it. And when I came into the house, my mother said my father had packed his bags and left. That was his typical effort to run away from gangsters who threatened to kill him. He would pack
Because he owed money.
He owed money. And the Shylocks were after him. And I remember as a kid of 13, I would go down to the mailbox to see whether anybody was watching, to see that there was a return address on any mail that my father had sent, because I was concerned that they would then know where he was.
So you, even as a child, were really aware of who your father was and the difficulties he faced.
Yes, and at times when he was not pressed for money and betting on a compulsive manner, he was a good, wonderful father. So in these situations, particularly gamblers are in the Damon Runyon type. They're good and they're bad. But when they're bad, it's just an awful price to pay. The police were at the house, the apartment, the FBI was at the apartment, because the gangsters would come and try to break the door down.
Where was this?
In Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn.
And
what was your mother's name?
Lillian.
And do you have siblings?
My sister is Janet.
Older or younger?
Younger.
Was she also affected by this?
She was, but she had a certain way of turning it off and going out on dates while there were virtual fistfights in the apartment.
Wow.
And gangsters were threatening to come in. She would manage to leave and go on a date. I took it
Harder?
The hardest.
Jay, were you scared at the time as a child?
Well, I was scared of the people in the building because my father borrowed money from everybody in the building. And I would go down the back staircase, and while we lived on the 6th floor, I never took the elevator because I was ashamed. And I remember going as a kid at age 14 to Coney Island after a big snowstorm and clearing a bench and sitting out there and looking at the water and saying, is there any way that I'll be able to get out of this? So it was a very troubled.
Did you love your father?
I loved my father. And he would run away, as I said, from time to time. And they would be after him. But
and then why and how would he come back?
Well, he, in many ways, preyed upon his brother, who was younger than he was.
Your uncle.
And my uncle. And my mother would pay off the Shylocks on a promise that he wouldn't gamble again. But I would come in one time and I saw him with the racing sheet. And I remember sitting at the window waiting for him to make the turn on a Friday night heading home, because that meant the Shylocks hadn't taken money from him. But if he didn't have the money, he would be in a gas station calling at 11 o'clock wanting to know if he could come home.
What finally happened to your father?
My father died at age 57. He was a diabetic, and he was so disheartened because he looked so bad from congestive heart failure that he couldn't get a job. And he just ate the wrong food and just devoured ice cream and ate himself to death. And so he died at that early age.
Was that hard on you?
It was very hard on me. It was terrible.
How do you think it's affected you as an adult, the experience you had as a child with a father who was a seriously addicted gambler?
Well, I always worried about genes. And but luckily, I decided to be the opposite. And it never impaired me in terms of my mission. I never had an interest in gambling or wasting my money. I wanted to have a stable existence, and I was very fortunate to find a wife that I have been with for 60 years.
She's in the control room right now.
Yeah, she's
Amazing.
played an amazing
Yes.
part in my
And
life.
by the way, she's a very prominent
Yes.
figure in this book.
That's
and
true.
You say wonderful things about the way in which she was a partner.
That's
Yes?
right. That's right. I brought her, because of her skill, she's a psychologist, into the mix of the criminal cases where a jury had to be picked, and she had insight into the people who were being questioned by the judge. And she would say, pick this one, pick that one, and I, for the most part, listened to her.
This is Rema.
Rema.
You're married, as we tape, almost 60 years.
That's true.
How long did you know her before you were married?
About 7 months. I knew it. This is very interesting, where there was a crowd of 350 people packed into a room, and they were looking for a date, singles weekend. I looked at her, and I saw her for 2 hours. I looked at her, and I didn't have the courage to go over to her. I went back to my aunt's Cook Lane, and she had promised the family a great evening. And I said, no, I had unfinished business. I went back, and as fate would have it, she was plucked from the 350 people and planted as the sole person in the lobby.
Wow.
It was, to me, incredible. It was meant to happen. He or she took a person that I was looking at for 2 hours out of a crowd of 350 and put her in the lobby alone.
I am so
I
happy
couldn't
for
avoid
you.
her.
A wonderful love affair?
Yes, I knew immediately that I would marry her.
Come back one more moment to your childhood. What was the Jewishness that surrounded you? Any at all?
Very little. Very little.
Did you know you were Jewish?
Of course I knew I was Jewish. The family was not Jewish in practice.
Was not observant.
Not observant.
But there was a Jewish identity.
There was a Jewish identity. I represented a rabbi. And he closed the door and got all the necessary things, and he bar mitzvahed me at age 50.
Good for you.
In the office. But no, there wasn't religion. There was strife, turmoil, and when the father runs away and you know that killers are after him. In fact, when I had a job, there was information that a contract had been put out on him, and the person who did the contract was on the second floor of the New Yorker hotel. I got 2 detectives from the district attorney's office who I knew, and big bruises, and we went up to the second floor of the New York hotel, and they grabbed the guy and pinned him against the wall and said that if anything happened to my father, there'd be a price to pay. But there was an actual contract. Mm-hmm. So it had reached a point of beyond turmoil.
At any point in your life with Rema and the creation of your own family, does Jewishness become important to you?
I can't really say, Mark, that I was observant. I felt a very strong connection to Israel intellectually. I was very concerned about its existence with respect to the armaments that Iran has, the Palestinians' desire to eradicate them and push them to the sea. And if any controversy arose, my Jewishness came forward, front and center.
What does that mean?
Well, I believed in the struggles of the Jewish people, that they had a right to their own existence and a place where they could be free, observant, and not constantly under fire from a neighboring community. I was also concerned about the countries that had pledged to destroy Israel. Intellectually, I was committed 100% to my Jewishness.
Okay, I want to ask you some questions about the law.
Yes.
I want to begin with, all of this relates to, in some way, constitutional issues. But let's begin with the question of how you explain to somebody who doesn't understand why you would defend some of the people you defended who were obviously criminals, some of whom, by the way, did things that were socially unacceptable. You were defending them. And the quintessential example of this in contemporary, when I say contemporary, the last 20 years, was the O.J. Simpson case, where there wasn't I couldn't find one person who thought he hadn't done it. And the question was asked, should he have had this, dream team that included Alan Dershowitz? And I've asked Alan the same question. I'm asking you. If O.J. Simpson had come to you and said to you, I want you on my team, would you have said yes?
I would have said yes.
What's your explanation for why you, Jay Goldberg, would have defended and would defend someone who's probably guilty?
Well, I have a whole section dealing with representation of men of honor.
Yes.
And people say, how, if you had government service prosecuting these people, you could now defend these people? And I'm reminded of Judge Weinfeld's statement when he was about to sentence a client, Joe Scarface Agone. He said, Mr. Goldberg, don't you think he should suffer economically for the crime he committed? I said, don't worry about that, Judge. I've taken care of that already. And somebody would say that the fees that I charged were designed to take the profit out of crime. And it was in response to the way my father had suffered at their hands. I represented them, but very rarely did I go easy on them with respect to fees. In fact, one of the great legends of organized crime, Matty the Horse, Iannello, said that there were gangsters who were afraid to come to the office because I charged and insisted and never failed to get a fee that I charged. And
they needed you. They needed you, Jay.
Well, I said to a major gangster, Tony Pro, whose the bodies were lined up in a dump, and he was the leader of 560, a local union of the Teamsters. I said, Tony, when I say the fee is due on Wednesday, you can pay me on Monday or Tuesday, but don't ever pay me on Thursday or Friday. But you have to.
Did you ever have a problem?
Never. I can say, lawyers will tell you that after years of practice, they have unpaid bills. I never had an unpaid bill.
But that doesn't answer the question. I am very glad you in some way had retribution for your father.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm asking you a philosophical question. You have to go to sleep at night. You and Rema have to lie in bed together and sleep peacefully.
Yes.
Have you ever had a bad night because you said to yourself, I helped a criminal in some way either get off, or you have a chapter here on how one of your cross-examinations had an influence on Joseph Gambino, who was one of the most serious gangsters America has had in contemporary Jewish contemporary life. So I'm asking you, did you ever feel bad, or how do you justify to yourself the fact that you, as a brilliant legal mind, used your mind to get criminals either off or reduce sentences?
Well, if you read the book carefully, you'll see that I was very selective in the people that I represented. I didn't represent a street character. And I must tell you that the leaders of even the Sanitationsmen Union is a classy guy. The classiest was Jimmy Blue Eyes, who together with Meyer Lansky were responsible for Las Vegas. He was a gangster emeritus. Worldwide, he was known. But he was very, very intelligent. He could converse with you for hours. The newspapers and magazines were key things in his life. My wife used to enjoy the discussions with him about contemporary affairs. So whether it was Meyer Lansky or Jimmy Blue Eyes or Matty the Horse, these people, I had no problem in testing the government's obligation to present proof.
The government has an obligation.
Yes, it seems to me I had a function to see whether the government met its burden of proof. And in many cases, the government didn't meet its burden of proof. There was ballyhoo about, for example, Bess Meyerson. There was no chance that she could get a fair trial when one looked at it, because Giuliani had so polluted the atmosphere in the press that everyone who the judge interviewed said they read the papers and they believe her guilty.
And you should remind the audience, what was she charged with?
Very serious charges. She and her boyfriend supposedly corrupted a well-known legendary justice of the Supreme Court, Hortense Gable, to reduce the alimony obligations of Andy.
Which court?
That was in the Supreme Court, New York County.
Yes, New York Supreme Court.
But the U.S. Attorney, Giuliani at the time, decided to prosecute it as an obstruction of justice in federal court.
They went after her enormously.
Terribly.
Horribly.
The press was so hostile, and the leaks were so rampant and orchestrated that when you looked at it, there was no possibility of getting a fair trial. But the judge took the case and questioned each prospective juror and weeded out the people who couldn't follow the instruction that no matter how you felt as a person, whether you felt that she was guilty or not, the test was, has the government met its burden of proof?
Were you at all reluctant to get involved in that case?
No, because She had been recommended to me by somebody who I treasured, and I had a problem with her because as I interviewed her, I suspected that there would be difficulty in collecting fees and getting her to comply with direction. She was so taken with herself that I brought in a terrific attorney who figured prominently in the defense and shared the acclaim that we got for the acquittals. And that was Frederick Hafitz, who had been chief of the criminal division in the United States Attorney's Office. And it was a difficult representation, pre-trial, because as you remember, she went to Pennsylvania and she was arrested for shoplifting. And I chose to represent her consort, Andy Capasso, who was a sewer contractor, who she fastened upon as her boyfriend. Now, I got to tell you this. She was very classy and spoke beautifully. Andy, who was her boyfriend, was a dems and does and four-letter words of, and I couldn't understand the attraction. And that was her boyfriend. Mm-hmm. He couldn't say anything that offended her. It offended me, but, and he was easy to deal with. He supposedly had certain connections that if he said the money would be there on Monday, the money was there on Monday. Mm-hmm. It was difficult with respect to Bess to control her and make her realize that she was a defendant in a criminal case.
We should also remind everybody, she may have been the first individual to be the...
She was the only Jewish Miss America.
Yes, but she also, yes, that's absolutely true. I was talking about the job she had for New York City.
Yes, she was very close to Ed Koch. And people thought that there might be a relationship, but there wasn't. She was his beard, and when he went to certain affairs.
They would go together.
And he appointed her Commissioner of Consumer Affairs.
And she did a fabulous job.
She was very bright. Yeah. And here's the point that makes this case worthy of talking about. The judge tried desperately to get her daughter, the judge's daughter, a job. His daughter was somewhat unemployable. Bess found out that she was the judge on her consort's case. So she courted the judge to get a job for the judge's daughter, but the judge had to reduce the alimony. The judge reduced the alimony, got a job for the daughter, and the judge did that. Then when the criminal case was brought, the daughter had fallen in love with a federal agent, and she tape recorded her mother at the dinner table acknowledging that she had done wrong and testified against her own mother. It was a horrible...
Oh, it's true that you have seen, in some way, the best of us and the worst of us.
Of course, I have, because I just finished a short synopsis of the Kennedys and the untold story of how people don't realize that while they were heralded as heroes in the fight against organized crime, they tried to obstruct an investigation that would have allowed organized crime to continue in an area where the citizens were fearful of their lives.
Why did they do that?
I was a prosecutor, and the Allies one had seconded his nomination at the convention. Kennedy's nomination at the convention.
Kennedy.
And so the brother who adhered to... Robert adhered to this principle. First, is it good for my brother? And second, is it good for the nation? the brother was his central feature and interest. And if the mayor, the head of the organized crime ring, was his brother's friend, then it was his friend. And as the book recites, while I thought he was the best of people, he was not. There were forces that caused him to be less than admirable.
And here is who?
Robert Kennedy and John
both
Kennedy.
Of them.
Both of
yes.
them.
Did you like Robert Kennedy?
I didn't like what he had done. He abandoned me. I was the prosecutor sent to Gary, Indiana, to clean up the area of crime and corruption. I thought, everything would be protected.
He would have your back.
He would have my back. And Byron White, who became a justice of the Supreme Court,
right,
was the Deputy Attorney General, and he would have the FBI protect my wife and myself against mafia threats and otherwise, because Lakewood, New Jersey was the farthest west I had been. And here I was going to Gary when they couldn't even pronounce a bagel. It was a bagel. And I thought there'd be protection because he would be the best of people. But he wasn't. There was always something that made a person less than perfect. Mm-hmm. And it showed up in that context. And if it were not for the citizens that gathered together, the area would still be the highest murder rate in the country per capita.
What about civil rights? Do you give the Kennedys credit for civil rights
yes,
in America?
Yes, it's very interesting. The Kennedy story shows that people can change. Kennedy found the better angels of his existence, obviously to take off on what was said when Abraham Lincoln passed away. He turned from a battle against organized crime and Jimmy Hoffa to civil rights. And I think he believed in it. And he was to be commended.
Both of them.
Well, John Kennedy was reluctant to fight for the equal rights. In fact, Jackie Robinson backed Nixon.
Correct.
Against
the
Kennedys.
Right.
Because he thought the Kennedys were not committed to fighting for civil rights.
And you feel there's some truth to that?
At the time of John Kennedy's tenure, the fight against abuse of civil rights was not wholeheartedly supported.
Okay. At one point, they do come to the aid of Martin Luther King.
Yes. Robert Kennedy made that famous call that got Martin Luther King released from jail.
Correct.
In fact, there's a movie that I really commend, and that's Green Book. It tells the story where Robert Kennedy had interceded to free a civil rights, a victim of civil rights abuse.
Okay, this is out of left field, Jay. Out of left field. Do you have any instinct as to whether Martin Luther King was murdered by some conspiracy in America, or whether it was James Earl Ray alone?
Well, I always wondered where James Earl Ray came from. That he seemed to me to be a person that could be used. And I never was committed to the proposition that it was James Earl Ray who was responsible solely for the assassination.
But you have
of
no inside information.
No, I have no inside information.
Okay, okay.
Except the word of several FBI agents that had worked on the case.
Who said what to you?
Who said that they had believed that James Earl Ray didn't have the wherewithal to pull this off on his own, but they couldn't come up with any proof.
Yes.
And that was disheartening to me.
Okay. Incidentally, as you look at your career, did you have more fun as a prosecutor or more fun as a defense attorney? I know you made more money as a defense attorney, but where did you have more fun?
As a prosecutor, because my penchant was always to fight crime. And I loved being a prosecutor. If I could have made money,
The same kind of money.
I would
You
have
would have
stayed.
stayed, right?
I would have stayed. Except that when I was thrust into national affairs having to do with the president and as outlined in the book,
Yes.
it was disheartening at that point too. It wasn't as good as I had hoped for.
You mean the prosecutorial system?
No, but when you get to prosecute the most important people, there is politics
Yes.
that comes into play. It's never that you prosecute a person of great importance, that there isn't some politics that comes in to thwart you in some way. And but if I had my way and I could be a prosecutor all my life, I would have been a prosecutor. I make in my mind the representation of the criminal element is yes, taking the profit out of crime.
Okay, very good. There is a notion now in contemporary America that the police, that the system, the district attorneys,
Yes.
that they're devious. And,
Yes.
I'm not sure corrupt is the right word, but they don't play by the rules, and
Right.
they're twisting arms, and they're creating situations where people have to do plea bargains and have to sing or compose. What's your sense of this?
Well, first I'm going to tell you something, and I don't mean to promote the book. There's a chapter where I come back from Washington, and I believe that the police are so corrupt that they tailor stories, that they demand money, that I got for myself a briefcase with tape recording equipment, and I taped the cops. And
When was this?
when I came back from Washington,
What year are we in?
well, in the 70s.
Okay. Was this the Knapp Commission?
It's before the Knapp Commission.
Okay.
I preceded the Knapp Commission.
Okay.
I was my own Knapp Commission. I said after being a prosecutor and sending away criminals, I come back to New York and the criminals are now policemen. So I did something that was eccentric. I got a briefcase, as I said, with recording equipment, and I would go to court, and a cop would want to see me and say, I'll change my testimony if you pay me $500, or I'll let your man go if you pay me $1,000. And it was rampant in the city. And I came close to a terrible tragedy. I went in the bathroom with the marble sinks, and two monster detectives came in, and they said to me, are you wearing any tape recording equipment? Because I had a beeper, and they thought I might have a tape recorder. And I said no, but sitting at my feet was the briefcase recording the conversation. Had they seen the briefcase, they would have smashed my head against the marble sink.
That must have been scary.
It was scary.
Yes.
But 50 cops were arrested, and the moral squad was disbanded, and I sent
did all that?
I did all that.
Did you know Serpico?
No.
Okay. And is it still true to today? Do you worry that the same kind of corruption
Yes.
goes on?
Yes, 100%. I'm very pleased that the district attorneys of New York County and Kings County, and the hope is that the Bronx County will have a integrity assessment to decide whether there's proof that people were guilty of the crimes for which they've been sentenced. And unfortunately, the victims of these wrongful convictions are black. And that troubles me a great deal. There was one detective in Brooklyn that was responsible for 12 people getting sentenced by the use, so it is claimed, of perjured testimony, coerced confessions, and wrongful acts. And 12 people have served 10 years, 15 years, when the proof is shown that they were innocent all along. But the police somehow feel that they have open season with respect to the black population. And that troubles me a great deal.
Are you suggesting that there is racism within police departments?
Yes, there is racism. There's a great deal of black crime. There is.
Yeah.
But and whether it's poverty, whether it's the lack of guidance from a family that doesn't have a father, and there's nothing that is instructive in the family life, there is this degree of criminal conduct. But the police do prey upon the blacks in a way that I think the district attorneys are now recognizing.
And I want to understand, are you talking about New York alone, which you know the best?
No, I'm talking about throughout the country.
Does this mean that you don't like policemen?
I like policemen. I think if we didn't have policemen, there would be anarchy. People don't react to the absence of a regulatory force like the police. They can't be counted on to do the right thing without the police. I'm talking about the bad apples.
Are there only bad apples as opposed to, a barrel of good? Is the barrel basically good, or is the barrel basically bad?
I think the barrel is basically good. And I commend the police. I don't want there to be a misunderstanding.
Yes.
Without the police, there'd be a terrible price to pay.
I agree with you. And there's bad apples in every profession.
That's true, but it has more of an effect.
Correct.
When a person goes to jail and serves sentences when they're free, when they're innocent.
It's an outrage.
It is.
It is what America is never supposed to be.
Right. And you have to consider who are the victims. And it's rather remarkable to see only one class of people who were supposedly wrongly convicted.
You're saying overwhelmingly they happen to be people of color and minorities.
That's true.
Yes.
And that's a big problem.
I want to ask you a different kind of constitutional issue. It seems to me that the biggest single issue conceptually facing America today is the question of the First Amendment and free speech. And what constitutes free speech, Jay, as opposed to what constitutes hate speech.
Yes.
And I want you to speak about that, because at the moment, what people are saying, people are taking license to, in some way, regulate speech,
Yes.
even curtail speech,
Yes.
based on the principle that the speech they are curtailing is hate speech.
Yes.
And therefore, hate speech is okay to restrict. And in some way, there's logic to that. At the same time, we have a tradition here, a Supreme Court tradition, which has protected a wide swath of speech which is hateful. I want to hear your position on this. How do you distinguish and defend free speech? And do you ever say free speech, yes, should be limited if it's hate speech?
Well, free speech is not absolute. And I hope you realize that.
Absolutely.
And I mean, the classic comment of Justice
Fire
Holmes,
in a crowded
fire
theater
in a crowded theater.
when there is no fire.
Oliver Wendell Holmes. But so regulation is possible, but it's the test that the government and the Supreme Court uses. It's not merely whether it was rationally done, but there's closer scrutiny to see whether it passes the test of a need to regulate the speech. If the speech is of a kind that would call for violence or action, it can be regulated. And that's the clear and present danger test. And so it seems to me that the speech has to be looked at as to whether it creates a clear and present danger of violence and whether there's it can survive the close scrutiny test anytime you attempt to regulate speech. But speech can be regulated.
Okay, but the examples that are used right now tend to be political. People argue, the left argues that the speech that's coming out of conservatives or people who they describe as white supremacists,
Yes.
or people who support Donald Trump, that in some way that speech is so intrinsically hateful,
Yes.
they have a right to restrict it. Is that kind of speech in your mind? Is the principle of hate speech applicable to that kind of speech?
I don't think so. If they are giving their views, however offensive
Yes.
it is. I remember when I was in the Department of Justice looking out the window, and there was this major hate monger carrying placards around the Department of Justice, and there was no way to regulate him unless they created a clear and present danger or survived a close scrutiny test by the Supreme Court as to whether it would lead to free speech, to action that could be regulated by the legislature. But you've hit on a very sensitive note. Donald Trump is my client.
Yes.
And has been my client since 1990.
You began with matrimonial cases.
Matrimonial. But
and you never lost.
No, and there were 10 cases. And there is a note from him that I have that says that of all the lawyers, he considers me.
He loves you.
It's true.
He writes a love note to you.
Look at this, Mark. Read that.
Okay, this says, Dear Jay, thank you for the wonderful note you sent me over the Christmas holiday. This was in 2012. He's
yes,
now he's not president.
In 2018, I have one at home.
Okay,
I have
this
many.
is 2012.
Go ahead.
I truly appreciate your great words and support. There's never been a lawyer more important to me than you. It is very important to me that you know that. Say hi to the fabulous Rema, your wife. Best wishes, Donald. By the way, did you black out something here?
No, he underlined.
Oh, he
That's his fat pen, you see.
He underlined.
But notice that it's always say hello to the fabulous Rema.
Yes, he always says that to you.
Always.
Yes.
And there are like 20 of these letters. And
okay, but you say that because I mentioned Trump.
Yes.
It made
he never had, in my complete time with him, and that includes this year when he called me about who I would think should represent him. And I might say, I said it shouldn't be Giuliani. And I said that Michael Cohen would turn on him immediately. This is when and that he should never submit anything in writing because Andrew Weissman, who really runs the show for Mueller, can't be trusted. And in all the time I was with him, there was never a hostile word about a woman or a color. He at all times was just a businessman who attended to his affairs and cherished his children. So when you
I
say...
want to make sure. He's not a racist?
He's not a racist. Never.
He's not anti-woman, a misogynist?
No, no, no.
Is he anti-Muslim?
That comment, I am convinced, that was said on the bus was an attempt to connect with guys who had real problems. My wife, who's in the green room, will tell you that after all these years, we truly love him because he was always warm, and everybody in his office, the chief of staff, the lawyers were Jewish. The chief of staff was a woman. He never said anything hostile about a Jew because the staff was Jewish. His chief of staff, after Norma died, is Jewish, and it's a bad rap because he used improper words with Charlottesville. I just attribute that to the fact that he wasn't a politician and he said the wrong thing. But by no means, Mark, and I would be completely candid with you, has he ever said things which caused my wife and I to question whether he is anti-Semitic, anti-white, black, anti-woman. It's just a bad rap by politicians who don't understand him.
Are you a liberal or a conservative, Jay?
I would say I'm a liberal.
By the way, your whole life you've been a liberal.
Yes.
Everything you've stood for is
Yes.
liberal. So you're not saying this because there's a political bias here that drives you to say it.
None. I look you straight in the eye and I tell you that what I say is the result of closeness that one would have for a brother. Whenever there was a problem, he would intercede to help my family, to help my wife, to help me. He showed warmth and an understanding that the average politician doesn't have. I don't think previous politicians could read the blueprints of a 100-story building, or when you do a brief and you cite many cases, call for the cases themselves and read them to see that the lawyer has cited the cases correctly. I mean, he's much more than he's portrayed to be by the New York Times or the Washington Post. He's just gotten a bad rap because of loose language.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back for a moment to the issue of free speech and hate speech.
Yes.
Should David Duke be restricted in what he says?
No.
Okay.
No.
Do you know who Alex Jones is?
Yes.
Should he be thrown off of Facebook and YouTube?
Civilly, they have a right to do that. You're talking about private companies.
Yes.
But you're not talking about the government.
So the government should not censure him.
The government should not censure
It didn't
him.
bother you that YouTube or Facebook or Google is now deciding who and what we should hear?
Of course. I mean, there the government should step in. They have too much power. The antitrust division should move in and break these things up. For example, Amazon has too much of a market share to be allowed to function. And certainly Facebook should be looked at to see whether they have abused the power that was given to them. They're under the regulation of the FCC, and there's regulation that could be done by private entities. In fact, Alex Jones has been sued by the people at Sandy Hook because of his claim that it was a made up event.
Crazy, just crazy.
Totally crazy.
Yes, but I'm not sure that I want the government to say he can't speak.
I'm saying,
and I'm not sure, quite honestly, I want even private groups to say he can't speak. It scares me.
individuals have sued him.
That's okay,
That's okay,
right?
because that's not the government.
That's
The
correct.
Constitution doesn't apply.
And he gets to fight. He can win. He can lose.
That's right.
You know.
That's right.
But what about Farrakhan? What do you think? Should there be any limits to him?
No, I don't think so. And here's the thing that we have to consider, and we've talked about it. Government, private litigants. They can be private litigants. They can take Alex Jones on, but not the government. When we talk about the government, we talk about the First Amendment. When we talk about a private litigant, that's not the First Amendment.
What about on college campuses? At one
Terrible,
time, when you and I were younger, college campuses were the bastion of free speech.
Yes.
Now, a certain kind of speech, is it appropriate? I don't care whether you like her or you don't like her. You like what she says, you think what she says is hateful. If an Ann Coulter is invited to speak
Yes.
on a college university, on a university campus, don't go if you don't want to listen to her.
That's true.
But, Jay, it infuriates me. It offends who I was from my parents and what I grew up as. That now the left, the liberal wing of our society, which is where I grew up, is now saying we will limit who is allowed to come on a college campus.
No, I don't think that kind of approach should be permitted. Ann Coulter is an author of a number of books. She's intelligent. She has something to say. And if you don't want to hear her say these things, just don't go to one of her sessions. And that applies to other groups that have emerged on campus, groups that are hostile to Israel.
Yes.
Now, think about that. They never had groups like that. There are groups in all of these campuses in New York where they're arguing the Palestinian cause and saying that Israel is a genocidal movement. And that's very troubling. Very troubling.
By the way, that has become a very sensitive, hot issue in the Jewish community. And this is the way the question is posed. I want your answer. There are Jews who believe that BDS, the attempt to boycott, encourage divestment, and sanction Israel, its goal, by the founders who created BDS, their goal is that there should be no Israel.
Yes.
This is a movement that really is trying to destroy a nation state of the United Nations. That's its goal. There are people who say that BDS should be in some way outlawed, or that if a state government supports BDS, it can be sanctioned by the federal government. And the attempts to create laws now which would in some way penalize those who support BDS. There are those who argue that although we hate BDS, that BDS is against everything humane.
Yes.
That the BDS movement is the single most immoral movement in the world today. It should not be limited by law in the United States. What's your feeling?
Well, with respect to the First Amendment, are we talking about political speech?
Yes.
Political speech should not be regulated.
It's protected.
It's protected.
Okay. And what about speech that says there should be no Israel?
Yes.
And that ultimately it's okay to do violence against Israel to eliminate it?
You can regulate appeals to violence, but there has to be a clear and present danger. It's changed somewhat since 1919. There is a gloss on the clear and present danger test. It's a different kind of test, but it's close. If it's not a call to violence, if it's an expression of a view, however hateful the group might be, you can't regulate it. It's not appropriate to regulate speech and say, this is hateful, this is not to be condoned.
In either direction.
Either direction.
Yes.
Now that's what makes the country great, because we have a view called the sunshine groove, that if you bring it out into the open, the forces of good will conquer it by debate and exposure of the speech.
And are you committed to that?
I'm committed to that.
I am too. There are people who would say you and I are naive.
Well, it disturbs me. If you ask me, am I disturbed by it? I'm disturbed by it 100%. But I recognize the limitations that the Constitution imposes or restricts a government from acting to control the aspect of political speech, however hateful it might be.
Okay. And at the moment, Jay, the definition of hateful is becoming broader and broader.
Yes.
More of what people don't like the other person saying is now being defined as hate speech. And therefore, the effectiveness of the First Amendment is being eroded.
Well, people are trying to get away from the view between protected political speech, however hateful, and appeals to violence.
We're not talking about violence here.
Then if it's not violence, we have to tolerate it under the view, once again, that the government survives the best by exposure of this hateful speech, and the theory is, under the sunshine principle, that there will be forces that can counteract the political speech, however hateful it might be.
So one more issue in this area. What's your view today of mainstream media? The mainstream media has an all-time low approval rate by the American people.
Well, I'm happy that you asked that question, because it gets to Trump's constant attack on fake news. I think when one reads the major newspaper in New York or in Washington, you just can't count on getting a truthful and complete and fair story. That there's such hostility for the president in particular, that stories are in there. And Comey, of all people, said that one of the front page stories of the New York Times is a fabrication. And so I look to the press in a different way than I used to. I used to think the New York Times was a Bible of truth, and the Washington Post was my Bible as well. But I'm committed to the proposition of many interviews with them that have been twisted and don't reflect what I have said, that I can no longer trust them to faithfully record events. And so I think the media has suffered because major publications have indicated stories which in my view are fake, or we can't tell whether they're fake, that other papers have adopted some of the stories, because small town papers rely on what the Times says, they rely on what the Washington Post says to draft their own stories. And so there is fake news. I know it firsthand because I've dealt with the papers, and what I say isn't what is reported. And I believe that the Trump has pointed to a major problem. And I'm very distressed to see papers that we grew up believing in as the fountain of veracity can't be trusted any longer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's how I want to end. Think for one moment. This is an unfair question, but I don't care. The moment, your favorite moment, as you look back on this storied career, all the most interesting people you've represented or you prosecuted, what's your moment in the courtroom that somehow when you think of it, you just get a terrific kick out of it? It's one of your favorite moments you carry with you.
Well, that's an easy one. There is a claim that one of the 5 organized crime families in New York is the Gambino crime family. And Joe Gambino was on trial. And the question is whether he was a member of the Gambino family. It was a very difficult case. And the witness was Sammy the Bull Gravano. And I cross-examined him, and the National Law Journal said that I put an end to his career, much like the people who testified that certain people were communists. I just put an end to the informer. And that cross-examination and the cross-examination in the Bess Meyerson case were the 2 high points of my defense career. But as a prosecutor, nothing compares to the role in the national prominence of the prosecutions in the suburb of Chicago, which was Lake County, Indiana. That thrust me into a situation that I never encountered as a DA, when after I was successful and Byron White said that maybe we'll send him to Las Vegas to clean up Las Vegas. And Ed Silberling, a major supervisor, said, no, he's going to run into Frank Sinatra. And I said to myself, here I was as a prosecutor in the southern, in Manhattan, concerned with burglaries and robberies, and all of a sudden I'm thrust into the middle of a big controversy. That stands out in my mind as a major event in my life, because I want to end with this statement. When Kennedy tried to remove me, RFK and JFK, the people of the community got together, and United States Steel arranged to have 50 coconuts sent to the White House. It was a takeoff on John Kennedy's rescue in PT 109, demanding that I remain in the area. And though I was recalled to Washington for a time, I was sent back. And I was age 29, and I got off the plane, and there was a big crowd, and I waved my hands in the air, and the Chicago Tribune said, like MacArthur, he's returned. And that was like a high point in my life.
A real kick. Incidentally, you open your book, The Courtroom is My Theater. You open the book with a courtroom scene, and I must tell you, my brother has been a lawyer his entire career. He has done various kinds of laws, and for a period of time he was a trial lawyer, and he was a defense lawyer for a period of time. He was never a prosecutor. So I've learned a little bit. You open your book with a court scene. I find very hard to believe that a judge would ever let you get away with.
Yes.
So I'm asking you now, is it true? Was that true? And when I say is it true?
Yes, it's 100% accurate. I was trying a case, and the claim was that Matty the horse had extorted money from Andrew the Hulk Giordano. But Andrew the Hulk was 6'5", 350 or 400 pounds. And Maddie was of regular, ordinary build, a little on the heavy side. And I said to myself, they'll never call Andrew the Hulk. So at the beginning of the case...
And they won't call him because of the way he looked
He looked.
and how intimidating a figure he is.
Yes, and and the jury wouldn't believe that Maddie would have put him in a state of fear.
Correct.
So at the beginning of the trial, I had a photograph of Andrew the Hulk getting out of the subway station. And I said to the FBI agent, is this a true depiction of Andrew the Hulk?
You said that in court.
In court. I said, how big is he? He said 6'5". He weighs 400 pounds. And this is a true depiction of him. And he said, yes. And the case went on for a couple of weeks, and these cases have a way of dragging on. And then it came time for me to sum up. And I said to someone who I had contracted to build a placard of the facsimile.
A life-size placard.
Life-size. And I said, I call Andrew the Hulk Giordano. And the judge was startled. And
First of all, this is when you're supposed to do your closing summary,
Yes.
your summation.
yes.
And now you're calling a witness. And it's not a witness, it's a piece of cardboard.
I say,
And the judge lets you get away with this?
yes, the judge was enormously hostile to me because as a prosecutor, I had locked up her partner in...
So how in the world did a judge allow you, when you've already called your last witness, you're
Yes,
now calling
yes,
witness out of order.
yes.
In addition, this is not a witness, this is a piece of paper. And you put... And
A placard.
It's a piece of paper that has a thickness. You are going to cross-examine a piece of paper,
Right.
and you're telling me a judge doesn't say to you, cut it out?
Now, Mary Johnson Lowe was enormously hostile to me. And I think she was taken aback. Because when I said I call Andrew the Hulk Giordano, in walked the guy holding the placard. And I said, take the stand. And he threw the placard on the witness stand. And I proceeded to ask it questions. I said, you didn't have any fear of Maddie. You were here, very available at all times. The judge was completely nonplussed by this. And she didn't act as many judges, or most judges would act. And the jury looked at it, and they started to laugh. And they acquitted Maddie of extortion. And I thought of that during the time when the case was first presented to me, that Maddie couldn't possibly have intimidated the Hulk. And the jury ruled in my favor. And
You feel, in essence, your client was innocent?
the question always is not guilt or innocence. Has the government met its burden of proof?
What you said was, you said to yourself, I can't imagine my client being intimidated by the Hulk.
No, vice versa. I can't imagine the Hulk
Yes,
being intimidated by Maddie.
by my client.
Yes.
By my client.
Yes. Well, my client in that particular case denied, as he must have, that he had intimidated Andrew the Hulk. And the government never called Andrew the Hulk, which supported my proposition in my head that the government itself had doubts.
Okay. And I wanted to quote that story because your book is entitled, The Courtroom is My Theater. And what you were able to do throughout your career is in some way bring theatrics
Yes.
to the work you did defending clients. Is that fair to say?
Yes. For example, I want you to have this. There are cases where if you have the ability to use humor, the prosecutor wants the court to be awake, solemn, and everything is terrible. But if the case is an appropriate one, and you're born with the skill to use humor, if you lighten up the courtroom, because Mark Twain said, a laughing jury never convicts. He said that in one of his stories.
Is he right?
He's right, because they acquitted in Bess Meyerson. And the judge said to the prosecutor, Mr. Goldberg laughed the case out of court. And, but it's not something that all lawyers can do. Because I had a colleague, and my wife selected his jury out in the island, and he started to try to be humorous. And everything he did fell flat, and it was counterproductive. But if you have that gift that few people have, and you can use humor, you can sometimes reduce the government's case
to a laughing stock.
Right,
Yes.
and that was the Bess
I
Meyerson
understand.
case.
Jay, when's the last time you were in court?
I was in court about a month ago in what is the largest civil case that we have pending in New York County. It has to do with the simple proposition of whether somebody who's twice as wealthy as Trump is said to be has been excluded from the Dakota. And
An apartment building in New York.
New York.
Very
where
famous
Yes,
apartment building.
but the Board of Governors is composed of people of the highest quality and standing. I mean, you just don't get on the board if you're an ordinary person. And he's spent millions and millions. And the question is, for 19 years, he's been fighting to get into the apartment that he's paid about $6 million, and they won't let him in. And so there's a question of whether he's denied his right of property. And the judge happens to be connected to one of the members who serves on the board. And there's a question of whether the judge should serve.
Or recuse himself.
Or recuse himself. And judges don't like to admit that they have a hostile relationship because of a relationship that they have with somebody. So that case has like 5 law firms, and I'm lead counsel in that case.
So you remain an active attorney.
Yes, yes, I spoke to the client to tell him to look at JBS today, and he said, I've got to get a copy.
You ever watch JBS?
All the time.
Oh.
My wife is a very big fan, Mark, of you and the program.
That's very lovely for me to hear. Jay, you're fabulous.
Good to see you.
And it is wonderful that you took the time.
No,
First of
no,
all,
no, it's my
Mazal
pleasure.
Tov on the book.
Oh,
The
you
Courtroom
know.
is my theater. I hope everybody picks it up. A great, great read. And I hope there are other times you come back and we'll talk more
Yes.
about the law. And
Anytime you want, Mark. It's a pleasure to come here and even to converse with your staff.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay.
Jay Goldberg, one of this country's most storied trial attorneys. He's also a leading constitutional scholar whose story you can read all about in his book, The Courtroom is My Theater, published by Post Hill Press. I hope you've enjoyed meeting him here on L'Chaim. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments to any of the ideas expressed by Jay Goldberg. Please email me, write me, post it on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I love reading what you have to say. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.